Anyway, this is my first time painting ever, and sorry about the setup, it's not the greatest in the world. I used a natural, non-toxic oil. Actually, it was supposed to be a burnt umber painting, and this is not how you're supposed to do a burnt umber painting, so actually I restarted this piece twice, so it looks completely different after this first clip, but I lost the footage for that one, so I'm just going to show you what I did originally for like the sketch area. And as you can tell, I was using way too much oil. That's one of the things that I've learned. Don't use too much oil when you're working with oil paints. Also, painting is a layering process, so you do have to wait in between layers every now and then, and I'm a very impatient person, so it's really hard for me to have the patience to wait. I know it looks really bad in the beginning, and trust me, it gets a whole lot better later on. I pretty much just sketched out a lot of what I was seeing with the paint, trying to test out different brushes, and it looks really much like I'm using watercolor, and it's because, like I said, I was using too much oil. It could have also been the brush that I was using too. I'm only using maybe like 1 or 2 brushes. So I had candles, and it was hard to get the volume on that. Also, I was painting a glass sphere. For the most part, I was just trying to get the volume of everything. This piece did come out really painter-like looking. I don't know how to get it smoother, and in a way I kind of like that painter-esque quality. I was also trying to define the darkest edges and the shadows. Also, with oil paints, it's better to use like a flat palette for your surface. Have like a piece of glass, and not like sharp glass, it was like a glass from a frame that I wasn't using, and I just put tape over the edges, so that's what you're seeing right there if you were wondering. There's a very huge learning curve to doing oil paints, to be honest, and right now it looks like this was done in crayon. Anyway, so here is the actual painting that I redid. So I just wanted to show you guys that process right there. Here's the actual painting, and as you can tell, I did a whole lot better of a job. It looks way more accurate. I tried to keep it really light in the beginning because I am known to be really heavy-handed with certain drawings, and as you can tell, I'm trying to make it a little bit darker. I was just kind of trying to like crisp the edges on everything to make it look like there was an edge to everything at this stage, and just trying to make things darker just because like I think it really needed that contrast with the painting. But yeah, this is the point where I actually did start making things a little bit darker and kind of like adding in white. It's so weird though, because like I know you're supposed to mix the paints on the palette, but for some reason, for me, it just works better to mix the paints on the canvas, if that makes sense. Like lay down one layer of a single color and then lay another layer on top of it. It's so weird and I don't know how to describe it. Also, if you just saw, like I had a paper towel, so I had to you have to constantly be wiping your brush. But there's another thing that is something that you have to be aware of. Use very little oil when you oil paint, and also have a towel on hand. Like a rag or a paper towel, because you will have lots of paint on your brush. Another thing too, like if you're starting off with oil paint, be aware that you are going to use a lot of paint. Like the more paint you use, sometimes it can be better. That was something that our professor had told us. You are going to use a lot of paint, and it just made me realize, you know, this stuff is so expensive, and now I understand why there are so many starving artists, because the art supplies are so expensive, and then you're using up all of this stuff, and it can be pretty disconcerting, you know. But I mean, it wasn't horrible. I mean, it came out pretty good. And I believe right now I'm just doing the highlights on all the objects, and then this is where we get into the fun part. I was contemplating on keeping those flowers in because I am not good at doing organic shapes. As you can tell, I'm like attempting to do the flowers, and it wasn't coming out the greatest. You guys might think, oh, like I think they look good. I think they came out pretty well. I've tried drawing flowers in the past, and if you guys, I think there's a video of me that I'm gonna make. There's a video that I'm making where I've done flowers in the past before, and flowers just give me a hard time to do. So eventually I just kind of like put white down on the canvas to block out the flowers. But the weird thing is that because the flowers weren't blue, it was hard for me to see it in umber, if that makes sense. And everything else was black and white, so it was a little bit easier for me to tell what shade, like shading and highlights were there. But because the flowers were blue and the sphere was blue, it was just really hard for me to figure out where the shade, the shadows were and where the highlights were. Because the flowers were just one single color. And it was just kind of hard for me to figure that out. So yeah, and here I am trying to fix this box because the boxes were like a hard time for me to figure out. The box was like not a perfect box, if that makes sense. It was a little bit crooked. And also, fun fact about oil paint is that you can literally mess up and you can fix any mistake with it. Like you can, if it's still wet, you can take off the paint with a towel and do highlights, or you can even, you know, paint over it. If it's like really, really dark, just wait and then paint over it. It's a little bit more lenient than that of acrylic. And personally, I've worked with acrylic before, and I've always thought it came out pretty flat in comparison to this. But of course, like I didn't know that like painting requires layers. Anyway, so I started working on the background, and I know I do have like a piece of cloth in the background. I just didn't really want to deal with it because at this point I was really frustrated with the whole thing, and I was just like, okay, I'm just gonna give everything an edge to it. And here's the thing that I do a lot with my pieces is that if there is a highlight on the object, I will go in the background and darken the background so that it contrasts against it. And I know a lot of professors or professional artists would say, oh no, don't do that, do what you see, you know. But because this is such a beginner like still life that I'm doing, I just didn't really see the need for it at the time. And like I said, I didn't really want to make it really hard on myself, and I think it just makes it stand out a little bit more, especially because you're only working with two different colors and different tones, and as you can tell, like, I'm still not working on these flowers. Like, I just did not want to deal with them. I was just kind of like, nope, I'm not dealing with you, I'm just gonna work on everything else. So it's just funny to see. I might add in here like a little section of you guys listening to music, or maybe this whole entire thing will have music. I don't know yet. And then I started working on the shadows, like the actual shadows that the objects were casting on one another. And this is not an accurate, you know, life-size scale for me. Like I said, I suck at accuracy. But I mean, it's not bad for a beginner. you know, like I did have problems and I struggled with a lot of things. And do I think some areas could be worked on? Yes, I do. And to be honest, one of my actual English professors told this to me one day, and they told it to the whole class, and they were like, no matter what piece of artwork you put into the world, you will never be satisfied with, because it'll always be your child and you will always find things to critique it on. So no matter what, I will always feel as though these images or these pieces of artwork that I've done will never be complete. I mean, they might look sort of complete to you guys, but you know, it's whatever. Anyway, then we start moving into actually doing the flowers, and oh guys, this was really hard to do. A lot of people, I had actually I posted like images of this painting on Instagram, and a lot of people were like, oh my god, what are those? And I'm like, they're flowers. I mean, it's really hard to tell because they're in one shade of color. So I really tried my best with these flowers. Flowers just give me a really hard time with doing it, and believe it or not, like I said, I actually only used maybe like 3 brushes, and they were all relatively like the same style of brush, just biggest to smallest, and yeah, so, and then I started putting highlights in it. I do wish that the top one, I mean, the top one looks better, it looks more like a flower, but the shading and the highlights just don't look the greatest, and the one at the bottom, by the end of it, it looks a lot better, even though it doesn't look like a flower. And I think it's because of that contrast, like I put contrast into it, so it just kind of looks a little bit better. But let me know what you guys think down below, and if you've ever painted or drawn flowers and you got pointers or tips for me, please let me know. They're so pretty to look at, but they're so hard to draw. It's just organic shapes are really hard for me to draw, in general. So, and then here is what it looked like at this point. And at this point, I mean, it didn't look bad. Okay, it didn't. And I'm so sorry for my head being in the way. But at this point, I was just like, you know what? I'm going to make it more contrast. Like, I know this box is white, but it had a really strong shadow on it. And it just, it blended in the background, and it needed more. And I know I didn't stick to accuracy, but I felt like darkening up certain areas and changing the tone on certain areas would have helped so much more. So I started doing that, and sometimes that actually can help a piece like with more of a contrast to things, and just makes it stand out, and you know, tricks your eye to make you think like, oh, let me look at different objects within the piece and not just look at this one section that looks most appealing. And then I was also having a really hard time with this glass ball. Now, I've drawn glass before, in plastic, in oil pastel, I believe, and that wasn't that hard, okay? And in paint, I was just like, how can I get this thing to look like glass and not look like everything else? Because it had to look like a different texture than everything else. And everything was already having like a decent texture on it. And so I started to realize, I think I have to put a crap ton of white in this ball. Okay, and I was defining these edges as well, as you can tell, trying to define everything. And I was also trying to define this flower at the top, because I just felt like it wasn't really popping out. I think out of everything, the top flower and the candle are probably the only things that I probably should still be working on. But I'm happy with where it is. I don't really want to waste more paint on it, so it's fine. And so with the ball, because I believe I'm getting to it at this point, with the glass ball, I realized I have to put more white into this ball, because that is the only way it's going to look transparent, because everything else is really, really dark, and you can see I'm doing that right there. And I decided, okay, I have to make this really, really white, and then have very thin edges of dark umber around it to make it look more like glass, because it had to look see-through. And you can tell it's starting to actually look more different. Like, it looks more cylindrical. It also looks more round, and it just has like a better texture to it than everything else, I guess. Like, it just looks like a different kind of texture. And then, even though you really can't tell in the still life, there were a couple like instances where like there was highlight, like white highlight coming through the glass. So I thought, well, if I do that, maybe it'll make it look more like glass, because the light is reflecting off on different angles of the glass ball. So I think it came out a lot better than it was before. I also made it a lot more rounder. And yeah, it came a long way, to be honest, guys. And I believe I'm actually working at the bottom. Like, you can't see the candle at the bottom, and I'm pretty sure I was working at that point on that section. And at this point, I'm just kind of like reiterating what I was already doing, just like refining different edges and like kind of globbing on the paint at this point. And just kind of making everything pop a little bit more, if that makes sense, because I didn't want everything to look really, really flat. And my professor actually told us, like, oh, you guys have to smooth out the paint. And I understand that, like, there is a cool appeal to that, but for some weird reason, I just really like the painter-like look, where, like, you could see the brush strokes and the texture. It just makes it look more authentic, I guess, in my personal opinion. It just looks more like a painting to me, in my opinion. And then here I was actually darkening that bottom flower a lot more, and I think I should have lightened the top flower a little bit better so that it could have matched the bottom one and made it look a little bit more like, oh, they're a matching set, kind of. And then that candle, I could not figure out for the life of me. Like, it was just such a pain in the butt. I think I should have actually darkened it a lot more so that it could have sanded out a lot better, but I was just too afraid to, and I was afraid it was going to start matching the box that was right next to it. But I think it needed that contrast. But let me down below if you guys think that I should darken that candle a little bit better. So yeah. And here is the final image. It's pretty much where I'm at right now. with this painting, and I think I'm just gonna leave it at this because, to be honest, it's best not to work a piece of art to the point of like perfection, because sometimes it's okay to have flaws, if that makes sense.